no race has claimed more lives and caused more devastating injuries than the deadliest motorsport event on Earth, the Isle of Man TT. Riders launch into chaos at over 200 miles per hour, with unbelievable crashes taking place that end in disastrous ways. Today we'll cover the 15 most devastating crashes in Isle of Man TT history and reveal the terrifying truth behind the unforgiving race. Starting with our first horrifying accident by Peter Hickman. Peter Hickman was having what seemed like another commanding performance at the 2024 Senior TT. The seasoned professional had already claimed victory in the Superbike race earlier in the week, proving once again why he was considered one of the most skilled riders on the mountain course. At 37 years old, Hickman possessed the kind of experience and racecraft that should have kept him safe on the treacherous roads. He had been flying during the early stages of the Senior TT, posting sector times that suggested he was capable of another victory. The crowd was beginning to take notice of the Englishman, who was making the mountain course look manageable once again. Everything was going according to plan, until suddenly, it all went wrong. The crash came at Ginger Hall during the second lap when Hickman was pushing hard for another victory. He had navigated this section countless times, knew every bump and camber change, understood exactly how his machine would respond. But at 150 miles per hour, disaster struck without warning as his bike veered off the racing line due to the loss of traction. The impact was swift, but not fatal, and in a moment that perfectly captured the surreal nature of TT racing, Hickman walked straight into the Ginger Hall pub after the crash. The image of the shaken rider sitting calmly in the pub, still in his leathers, became an instant classic among TT fans, a reminder that sometimes luck is the only thing standing between a rider and catastrophe. Hickman later described himself as a bit bruised and very lucky, words that perfectly captured how close he'd come to something far worse. But if you think a lucky escape is remarkable, wait until you hear about a champion whose spine was rebuilt with metal for number 14. David Datzer was 33 years old and living his dream as the IRRC Superbike champion when everything changed in an instant. The German rider had just broken his own lap record at Stair Mesto, showing the kind of pace that had made him a champion and earned him respect throughout the road racing community. He was the embodiment of precision and skill, a rider who understood how to extract maximum performance while managing risk. Datzer had been having a flawless session, his BMW responding like a finely tuned instrument to every input. He was leading the race with authority, distancing himself from the competition by over a second, a massive margin in road racing. The crowd was witnessing a masterclass in motorcycle control when suddenly fate intervened with devastating cruelty. As Datzer approached the first corner at high speed, a competitor behind him crashed without warning. The unmanned motorcycle became a deadly projectile, sliding uncontrolled across the track with terrifying velocity. Datzer had no way of seeing the danger approaching from behind. There was no time to react, no opportunity to use his championship-winning instincts to avoid disaster. The impact came at over 160 miles per hour with devastating force. The collision was so severe that Datzer was immediately airlifted to hospital, where surgeons discovered the full extent of his injuries. His spine had been severely damaged, requiring complex surgery that lasted hours as medical teams worked frantically to stabilize his shattered vertebrae. The randomness becomes even more terrifying when you consider what happened to our number 13 rider, a veteran who thought experience would keep him safe. Cameron Donald was exactly the kind of rider who should have been safe at the TT. The experienced Australian competitor had built his reputation on consistency and intelligent riding, never taking unnecessary risks, but always remaining competitive. He understood the mountain course's moods and demands, had learned to read its subtle warnings, and respect its unforgiving nature. Donald approached each TT with methodical preparation that would have impressed a Swiss watchmaker. He studied the course obsessively, analyzed data until his eyes burned, and prepared his machine with obsessive attention to detail. He was exactly the kind of rider who should have survived the mountain course through careful planning and respect for its dangers. During the senior TT, he was having a solid, controlled ride, running well within his limits and building confidence with each mile. Everything was going according to plan, when suddenly at Keppel Gate, something went catastrophically wrong. His machine left the racing line without explanation at 140 miles per hour, and physics took over with brutal efficiency. Donald fought the bike with everything he had, drawing on years of experience and knowledge accumulated through countless laps of the mountain course. But the machine was heading toward the stone wall with terrible inevitability, and no amount of skill could change the laws of physics once they had taken control. He was thrown from his bike, resulting in a dislocated shoulder and minor back injuries, which forced him to withdraw from the event. But experience failing is nothing compared to what happened to number 12 when multiple riders became victims of the same nightmare. Conor Cummins thought he'd learned to respect the mountain after his horrific 2010 crash, but the course wasn't finished with him yet. The Manxman had already survived one brush with death and returned to racing, believing his experience and hard-won wisdom would keep him safer. He was wrong. The mountain had been patient, waiting for its moment to strike again. Cummins had spent years rebuilding his body and his confidence after the devastating crash at the veranda. The physical scars had healed, but the psychological impact of nearly dying on his home course had changed him forever. He approached racing with a new respect for the dangers, but also with the knowledge that he couldn't stay away from the sport that defined him. During the Southern 100 at Ballachagan, what started as a routine race quickly descended into chaos. 4 riders went down in a devastating multiple crash on the opening lap. Cummins, Ivan Linton, Tom Parks, and James Cowton all caught in a nightmare of twisted metal and sliding motorcycles that unfolded in seconds. The crash happened so quickly that none of the riders involved had any opportunity to avoid the carnage. Bikes and bodies tumbled across the track in a horrifying display of the sport's capacity for sudden violence. The impact shattered Cummins' left forearm with sickening violence, requiring immediate airlift to Nobles Hospital, where surgeons worked to repair the damage. The Manxman, who had already cheated death once, was forced to face his mortality again, lying in a hospital bed, with another set of x-rays showing broken bones. If a multiple crash seems chaotic, number 11 will show you what happens when pure talent meets mechanical betrayal. Michael Dunlop was poetry in motion on his BMW S 1000RR, the multiple TT winner carving through the mountain course with the precision that had made him a legend. At 32 years old, he possessed natural talent that made veteran riders shake their heads in amazement, the kind of instinctive understanding of motorcycle dynamics that simply cannot be taught. Dunlop had been having an exceptional session, posting times that put him well up the leaderboard and suggesting he might be capable of another victory. He was in his element, pushing the BMW to its absolute limits while making it look effortless. The crowd was beginning to take notice of the Northern Irishman who was making the mountain course look like his personal playground. The BMW S 1000RR was responding perfectly to every input, the machine and rider working in perfect harmony as they carved through the course at speeds that defied comprehension. Dunlop was flowing through the sections with fluid grace, building speed and confidence with each mile when suddenly the machine finally said enough. At over 160 miles per hour, the rear wheel lost grip just enough to upset the delicate balance between man and machine. What began as a minor slide quickly escalated into a high-speed nightmare as the bike stepped out of line and physics took control with merciless efficiency. The bike high-sided violently, catapulting Dunlop through the air in a grotesque ballet of twisted metal and human flesh. His legendary abilities, honed through countless victories across the world's most dangerous circuits, fell silent before gravity's final judgment. The impact was catastrophic, sending the Northern Irishman tumbling across the unforgiving tarmac. That he walked away was testament to both his skill and incredible luck. But walking away from disaster pales in comparison to what happened to number 10, a young rider whose TT debut became a nightmare. Jaime Hamilton was 24 years old and living his TT dream when it turned into his worst nightmare. The young rider from Ballyclare had worked tirelessly to earn his place at the world's most dangerous race, scraping together funding and support to make his debut at the event he'd dreamed about since childhood. He was carrying the hopes and pride of his family and supporters. Hamilton had approached his TT debut with the kind of methodical preparation that impressed veteran competitors. He studied onboard footage until he could recite every corner, analyzed data from successful riders, and prepared his machine with obsessive attention to detail. He was exactly the kind of rider who should have had a successful debut. Hamilton was having the ride of his life during the senior TT, running well and building confidence with each mile. Everything seemed to be clicking into place as he found his rhythm on the mountain course. The young rider was beginning to understand why the TT was considered the ultimate test of man and machine. Everything seemed perfect when suddenly, approaching the 11th milestone on Kronkivati Strait, disaster struck with terrifying speed. At one of the fastest sections of the course, traveling at over 170 miles per hour, Hamilton's machine suddenly veered off the racing line without warning. The deviation was slight at first, just a minor drift that might have been correctable at lower speeds. But at 170 miles per hour, even the smallest mistake becomes catastrophic. There was no time to think, no time to react, no opportunity to use his preparation and training, just the terrible inevitability of impact. The crash was so severe that the race had to be red flagged and restarted. Hamilton was airlifted to hospital with serious but non-life-threatening injuries, his TT debut ending in the most brutal way possible. The young rider's dreams had been shattered along with his body, another reminder of the mountain's appetite for young talent. The appetite for young talent becomes even more disturbing with number 9, a legend who admitted he crossed the line between bravery and madness. Guy Martin was 28 years old and chasing glory with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The charismatic Yorkshireman had become the face of modern TT racing, his combination of skill, humor, and fearlessness making him a fan favorite around the world. But beneath the jovial exterior lay a competitor who would risk everything for victory. Martin was leading the senior TT and looked set to finally claim his elusive first TT victory. He had been flying during the early stages of the race, posting times that put him clear of the competition and suggesting he might finally break his TT duck. The crowd was beginning to believe they were witnessing something special. Then everything went downhill fast. The impact with the stone wall was devastating. A 170-mile-per-hour collision that should have been fatal. Martin was thrown from the bike and slammed into the barriers with sickening force, his body ragdolling through the air before coming to rest in a crumpled heap. You hit a wall 170 miles an hour. You're not coming out of that, are you? Just by luck, I hit it at the right angle and got away with it. The crash left him with bruising to both lungs and fractures to his spine, injuries that would have ended many careers. But perhaps more remarkable was Martin's philosophical acceptance of the risks he had chosen to take. If I'd ended up killing myself, my mom and dad might be upset, and Steph might be upset, but I have no regrets. The buzz that I get from the TT far outweighs the risk of getting killed. The rider who lived for speed had been reminded that speed could just as easily become his executioner. Martin's crash became legendary not just for its violence, but for his honest assessment of the risks he was willing to take in pursuit of victory. But philosophical acceptance means nothing when you consider what happened to number 8, a debut rider whose dream became a public nightmare. Jonathan Howarth was 29 years old and making his TT debut when the mountain course delivered a lesson in humility that nearly cost him everything. The rider from Barnsley was living his dream of competing at the world's most dangerous race, riding for Team Chefpak Kawasaki in what should have been the highlight of his racing career. Howarth had worked tirelessly to earn his place at the TT, scraping together sponsorship and support to fund his debut campaign. For him, this wasn't just another race, it was the culmination of years of preparation and sacrifice, the chance to test himself against the ultimate challenge in motorcycle racing. During practice sessions, Howarth had been building speed gradually and showing steady improvement. He was exactly the kind of rider who should have had a successful debut, methodical, intelligent, and respectful of the mountain course's dangers. Everything seemed to be progressing perfectly. But during the senior TT, disaster struck at the top of Bray Hill in the most spectacular and terrifying way possible. A violent tank slapper at 160 miles per hour sent Howarth's Zeech X10R into an uncontrollable wobble that defied all attempts at correction. The bike bucked and weaved like a wild animal, fighting against every input as it careered toward the spectator areas. Howarth fought desperately to regain control, using every ounce of skill and experience to try to save the situation, but the machine had developed a mind of its own. The crash was spectacular and terrifying. The bike sliding into a group of 11 spectators with devastating force, its front wheel breaking free and becoming a deadly projectile that smashed through the window of a nearby house. The violence was immediate and shocking, turning what should have been a racing incident into a public disaster that made headlines around the world. Miraculously, Howarth escaped uninjured, walking away from a crash that should have killed him, but 11 spectators were hospitalized. Their day of watching motorcycle racing turned into a nightmare of twisted metal and broken glass. The incident highlighted the ever-present danger, not just to riders, but to the brave souls who line the course to watch. A public nightmare is devastating, but number 7 shows what happens when mechanical violence reaches its absolute peak. Paul Orritt experienced one of the most violent tank slappers in TT history, a mechanical nightmare that should have killed him, but somehow didn't. The experienced rider was flowing through the course with veteran confidence when his machine suddenly developed a mind of its own, transforming from a precision instrument into an uncontrollable beast. At over 150 miles per hour, the bike entered a death wobble that defied all attempts at control. The handlebars whipped from side to side with terrifying violence, the front wheel oscillating so rapidly that it became a blur of motion. The tank slapper was so severe that it looked like the machine was trying to tear itself apart. The violence was beyond description, the bike bucking and weaving with such force that it seemed impossible for any human to maintain control. The forces involved were astronomical. The bike was essentially trying to throw its rider off while traveling at speeds that left no margin for error. Orritt's body was subjected to G-forces that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits as he battled to stay aboard the bucking machine. When the crash finally came, it was with devastating force that defied belief. Orritt was thrown from the bike with such violence that witnesses were certain they had just watched a man die. The impact should have been fatal, but somehow Orritt survived what many consider one of the most violent crashes in TT history. The aftermath was almost as shocking as the crash itself. Orritt suffered 6 broken ribs, broken shoulder blades, severe damage to his right hand, including a missing finger, and multiple other injuries that painted a picture of incredible violence. That he survived such a catastrophic incident was testament to both his skill and incredible fortune. But surviving mechanical violence is nothing compared to number 6, a rider whose dreams were crushed by the mountain's indifference. Ian Hutchinson was chasing his TT dreams when the mountain course reminded him why it's called the most dangerous race on Earth. The legendary rider, known for his resilience and determination, possessed the hunger and fearlessness that draws competitors to the TT, believing that passion and commitment could overcome the mountain's inherent dangers. Hutchinson had worked tirelessly to earn his place among the TT greats, making the sacrifices that all road racers must make to compete at the highest level. He understood the risks, but believed that careful preparation and respect for the course could keep him safe. He was wrong. The mountain doesn't care about preparation or respect. During the 2017 Senior TT, Hutchinson was pushing hard, trying to find those crucial extra seconds that separate the good from the great. He was building speed and confidence, beginning to understand the rhythm of the mountain course when disaster struck at the 27th milestone. At high speed, his Tyco BMW suddenly left the racing line, and physics took over with merciless efficiency. The impact was devastating. Hutchinson suffered a fractured femur, an injury injury severe enough to end his race and force his withdrawal from the event. The crash sent shockwaves through the racing community, another reminder that even the most experienced and celebrated riders are not immune to the mountain's appetite for tragedy. If you think that was a very horrible experience, our number 5 shows what happens when even legends can't escape the mountain's wrath. Guy Martin's return to the TT in 2017 was supposed to be a triumphant comeback story. The popular rider had been away from the mountain course, focusing on other projects and adventures, but the call of the TT proved irresistible. He was back to prove he still had what it took to compete at the highest level. Martin's return generated enormous excitement among TT fans who had missed his unique combination of skill and charisma. The media attention was intense, with cameras following his every move as he prepared for his comeback. Everyone wanted to see if the magic was still there. During practice sessions, Martin had been showing flashes of his old brilliance, posting competitive times and suggesting he might still be a factor in the races. The crowd was beginning to take notice of the returning hero who was making the mountain course look manageable again. But during the Superbike race, the mountain course reminded Martin why he'd stayed away. He was pushing hard, trying to recapture the magic that had made him a fan favorite when disaster struck with the familiar cruelty that defines the TT. The high-speed crash was violent and spectacular, sending Martin tumbling across the tarmac in a blur of leather and metal. The impact was severe enough to force his withdrawal from the senior TT, ending his comeback before it had truly begun. Martin's crash served as a brutal reminder that the TT doesn't care about popularity, experience, or previous success. The mountain course treats every rider with the same indifferent cruelty, ready to humble even the most beloved competitors without warning or mercy. Martin's story proved that no one, no matter how skilled or experienced, can ever truly master the mountain course. But humbling beloved competitors is nothing compared to number 4, when the mountain turns on its own sons. Richard Quail was Isle of Man royalty, a local hero who understood the mountain course like few others ever had. Born and raised on the island, he'd grown up watching the TT, dreaming of joining the ranks of legends who'd conquered the mountain. The course wasn't just a racetrack to him, it was home, familiar as his own backyard. Quail had learned to ride on the same roads that would eventually claim his life. He knew which corners were treacherous in different weather conditions, which sections demanded absolute respect, which bumps could unsettle a bike at speed. His knowledge of the course was encyclopedic, built through years of living and breathing the TT. During what seemed like a routine session, Quail was flowing through the course with the confidence that comes from intimate knowledge. He was building speed and finding his rhythm when suddenly, without warning, everything went catastrophically wrong. At high speed, Quail's machine suddenly veered off the racing line without explanation. The deviation was slight at first, but quickly escalated into disaster as the bike headed toward the stone walls. There was no time to react, no opportunity to use his intimate knowledge of the course to save himself. The impact was immediate and fatal, but surprisingly, Quail survived, and his incident resulted in serious injuries, including punctured lungs and a ruptured spleen. Despite the severity of the crash, he survived and later transitioned to a role as a rider liaison officer for the TT races. In recognition of his contributions to motorcycling, he was awarded the British Empire Medal in 2024, but the mountain's betrayal of its own is nothing compared to number 3, when age and wisdom prove meaningless against mechanical malice. Bob Price was 65 years old and should have been safe through experience and wisdom, but the TT doesn't discriminate based on age. The veteran from Gloucestershire had been competing at the TT since 1992, understanding the course's moods and demands better than riders half his age. He was exactly the kind of rider who should have survived the mountain course. Price had conquered Balagbom Bridge countless times over his 22-year TT career, knew every bump and camber change, understood exactly how his machine would respond to the famous jump. His experience was vast, his knowledge encyclopedic, his respect for the course absolute. During the first Supersport race, Price was flowing through the course with veteran confidence, running well within his limits and building speed gradually. Everything was going according to plan when suddenly, at Bal Og Bridge, disaster struck with terrifying inevitability. At 140 miles per hour, his machine suddenly left the racing line without explanation, heading toward the stone walls with devastating force. Price had perhaps 2 seconds to react, 2 seconds to draw on over 2 decades of TT experience to save himself. But sometimes experience isn't enough when physics takes control. The impact was catastrophic, causing massive blunt force trauma that killed him instantly. Price suffered a broken neck in the collision, his decades of experience rendered meaningless in a split second of mechanical malice. The coroner noted that race and road conditions were perfect. This was pure random tragedy that highlighted the TT's indifference to preparation and wisdom. The implications were chilling. If meticulous preparation and decades of experience couldn't save you, what could? The veteran who had survived so many dangerous moments, who had earned the right to feel confident through years of careful riding, was claimed by the mountain's arbitrary cruelty. But arbitrary cruelty pales in comparison to number 2 when dreams from halfway around the world meet the mountain's hunger for foreign talent. Yoshinari Matsushita had dreamed of racing at the Isle of Man since childhood, watching grainy footage in his bedroom in Japan and imagining himself carving through the mountain course. The 43-year-old rider had worked tirelessly to earn his place on the prestigious Taiko Suzuki team, his entry announced just hours before the fatal qualifying session. For Matsushita, this wasn't just a race, it was a pilgrimage to the spiritual home of motorcycle racing. He had sacrificed everything to make this dream a reality, working multiple jobs to fund his campaign, and shipping his equipment halfway around the world for the chance to compete at the TT. The Japanese racing community was following his progress with intense interest, proud to have one of their own competing at the world's most prestigious road race. Matsushita carried their hopes and dreams, representing not just himself, but an entire nation's passion for motorcycle racing. Everything seemed perfect, when suddenly, at Balakrai, his Honda hit a bump at the wrong angle. A minor disturbance in the bike's stability quickly spiraled into chaos as the machine veered off course. At 130 miles per hour, fate struck with merciless velocity. The reflexes that had made him a champion in Japan could only watch helplessly as destruction claimed its prize. The impact with the stone wall was swift and merciless, ending years of preparation and a family's pride in an instant. Matsushita had traveled halfway around the world to test himself against the ultimate challenge, but found only death on the mountain's unforgiving roads. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the Japanese racing community, a brutal reminder that the TT's hunger for tragedy knows no nationality. The rider who had sacrificed everything to fulfill his dream was claimed by the very course he had revered. His death marked the end of a journey that had begun in childhood and ended in tragedy on the roads of the Isle of Man. But even the destruction of international dreams cannot compare to our #1 entry, the most horrific survivable crash in TT history that redefined what the human body can endure. Conor Cummins wasn't supposed to crash at the TT. The 24-year-old local hero was having the ride of his life, running in the top positions and looking set for a podium finish that would crown him as the island's newest racing royalty. He understood the mountain course like few others, had grown up on these roads, and possessed the natural talent that made the impossible look routine. During practice sessions, Cummins had been flying, posting times that put him among the favorites for race week, and suggesting he might be capable of challenging for victory on his home course. The crowd was beginning to take notice of the young Manxman who was making the mountain course look effortless. But suddenly, approaching the veranda at 150 miles per hour, his bike hit a bump that launched it into the air. What should have been a routine jump became a nightmare as the machine landed awkwardly, sending it careering off the racing line toward the stone walls. Cummins fought desperately to regain control, using every ounce of skill and experience to try to save the situation. The crash was beyond description in its violence. Cummins suffered 5 broken vertebrae, several completely shattered, in an impact that should have killed him instantly. His spine was so badly damaged that it looked like it had been hit by an explosion. The vertebrae reduced reduced to fragments. The medical team that responded to the crash had never seen injuries so severe in a living patient. Cummins' spine was essentially destroyed, held together only by surrounding tissue and the grace of God. That he was still alive was miraculous. That he might ever walk again seemed impossible. Surgeons worked for 11 hours to rebuild what was left of his spine, inserting 2 10-inch rods running the entire length of his back, from pelvis to shoulder blades. The operation was one of the most complex. Spinal reconstructions ever attempted, with surgeons essentially rebuilding Cummins' entire back using titanium hardware. The main rods were interlinked with horizontal supports around the worst of the fractures, creating a metal framework that would hold his shattered spine together. The X-rays of his injuries were so severe they defied belief. His entire lumbar section was held together by metalwork, with the rods extending from just above his pelvis all the way to below his shoulder blades. The horizontal connecting rods around the worst fractures looked like scaffolding holding up a collapsed building. His story embodied both the TT's capacity for absolute destruction and the incredible resilience of those who choose to face its dangers. Cummins proved that even when the mountain breaks you completely, the human spirit can refuse to be defeated. Want to watch more kinds of these videos? Click on your screen now to watch more motorcycle content.